Hey everyone, welcome to our Milwaukee County Historical Society Thursday night digital discussion. We really appreciate you all tuning in, either on Facebook or on YouTube. This talk tonight will be rebroadcast, if you want to call it that. It'll still be available for you after the fact on our Facebook and our YouTube channel as well. If you're here from the March of Milwaukee 50th anniversary page, thank you for tuning in as well. I'm just going to kind of let people tune in and get settled here. So I'm going to go over some of the happenings at the Historical Society. First, my name is John Harry. I'm the Programs Fellow at the Historical Society. I'll be handling kind of the feed as far as like if you had any comments or questions, feel free to just type them in there and we'll get to them. Just want to let you know, next week we got another discussion about science and brewing and historic yeast cultivation about the historic Falk Brewing Company. So Thursday night next week, same place. We're doing that in conjunction with Mobcraft Brewing Company, so that should be a lot of fun. They went and harvested some historic yeast and made beer with it, so it's pretty good. We also, as the world is sort of starting to open up again, the Milwaukee County Historical Society, we will be opening here eventually, so just stay tuned for that. We do have a summer exhibit coming up. We're going to have it in its entirety, as well as some highlights from our exhibit, revealed Milwaukee's unseen treasures. But our politics exhibit, of course, it being an election year, we thought that was fitting. It's called Bigger, Better, and Brighter. So make sure you keep a lookout for announcements to do with that. And if you're not on our mailing list, make sure you go to milwaukeehistory.net so you can get in the know as far as what's going on. Before I introduce Rob and Adam and the whole talk tonight, there have been, if you look at like the New York Times bestseller list right now, it's a lot of books on like trying to understand what's going on in the world, right? We've got some of those that have to do with what's going on locally. And so if you want to purchase these titles, we would love if you went through us on them. So Selma of the North is all about the open housing marches that we're going to talk about here tonight. And then there's another book. So just to the right of that, you see the civil rights activism in Milwaukee, South Side struggles in the 60s and 70s. So that includes some of those, the open housing marches, but is a more broader context of what has been activism in Milwaukee in both the 60s and 70s. And one of the central figures you're going to hear about tonight is named Vel Phillips. And so we have a DVD that was put out by Wisconsin Public Television that you can buy as well. And you see the web address right there. That is milwaukeehistory.net/shop. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over here. I'll still be here. But like I said, if you have any questions, any comments or anything like that, please keep it respectful. That's the only real big rules tonight. But if this is the time to have some conversations about activism and race in Milwaukee. So that's, have at it in the comments on either YouTube or Facebook, no matter where you're asking. And Adam and Rob would love to get to those. So guys, I'm going to bring up Adam's screen right now and have at it.
When we first marched across the 16th Street Viaduct, I had never been so afraid in my life. I was a kid, and my mother was deceased, but I had my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, so I was loved, even though I didn't have my parents, but I was a loved child. And I was raised with love. And when I marched across that viaduct, they had estimated it was like 10,000 people. They were hanging out the windows. They were all on the side of us. And they were hollering, "Niggas, go home, go back to Africa." They were throwing things at us. When we passed Crazy Jim's auto, he was allowing these people to pull the light bulbs off of where he kept the cars and throw them at us. I had never experienced hatred like that. And I'm like, what could I have possibly done for someone to look at me? And I, if you notice, I'm 4'10" and a half, 66 years old, and I weigh $105. So if I was 11, I probably weighed 50. But I'm out there and I got this vigor and I got this fire in my heart and in my soul to say, you can move on the South Side if you got the money. You can bring your family over here. If they want to come to the North Side, they can come over here. Why do we have, Why can't I come and live over here? And these people were telling me, not only could I not come over here and live, nigga girl, you go back to Africa. I didn't know nothing about Africa. I was born in Chicago and raised in Milwaukee. It was terrible. My dear brother in Christ, Tommy Lee Woods, one of the Commandos, he's deceased right now, and he was one of the protectors of the march. He said, "Pam, duck," and I looked, and I didn't duck, and a brick hit me in my head, and I wear this scar. It's a badge of honor. I have it from here all the way to the middle of my head, where I was hit with a brick on that march. But I kept going. We covered it up, we held it, and we kept going, and we got to Kosciuszko Park.
So that was an interview that I did this week with Pamela Jo Sargent, a member of the NAACP Youth Council, sharing some of her memories in light of current events. Rob, why don't you get us started?
Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I am Robert Smith. I'm an associate professor of history over at Marquette University. I am the director of the Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach. And we want to welcome you tonight. This is an important conversation, obviously, and it's important not only for Milwaukee history, it's important for the national historical memory of the civil rights movement. It's important to our state history, and it's obviously important to Milwaukee County history. Thank you all for inviting us. But we would be remiss if we did not highlight how important this conversation that we're having tonight, how important it is to the events swirling around us across the country. As you see, our cities have erupted in direct opposition to ongoing police violence and murder and state violence directed overwhelmingly at African Americans. And so we want to recognize and honor the moment that we are in, and we ask you all to do the same. We're just going to take just a second or two, some silence, and just pay respect to those who've lost their lives and pay respect to the moment that we're in. Thank you very much. Before we get started, I'll let Adam Carr introduce himself a little bit in just a second, but there's some folks who've been very instrumental in the process of us putting these particular conversations together in the digital format. And Heather, Kristen, Keisha, we certainly appreciate all the direction and support that you've given us along the way. Adam, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll kind of move into this thing.
Yeah, I'm Adam Carr. I work behind the scenes at Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service. I've had the great honor to do a bunch of different projects, bringing me in collaboration with communities around Milwaukee, specifically learning their stories. I'm a son of the city, and I think it was probably the greatest honor of my life professionally and even almost personally to be a part of this project, March on Milwaukee. Let's get going here. Sorry. Having a technical issue, the slides weren't quite showing properly. We're going to get into it now. So to give you guys a little bit of a background, Rob and I actually first came together as part of the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches, which took place in 2017 and 2018. We got together with an incredible, I was just thinking about this earlier today, one of the most fantastic groups of grassroots people, artists, activists, academics, regular folks, marchers, youth council members, commandos, to do to honor the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches. And we did a thing called 200 Nights of Freedom. That was a really long project. It actually took place over 200 nights like the marches did. But we just wanted to shout out some of the folks that make this possible. Rob and I are in front of you right now, or in front of our computers, and you're in front of your computer. But really, what we are is just siphoning all the energy, all the stories, all the work that so many other people have done. So do not get it twisted. We are here sharing this story with you right now, but we're just fortunate to be the ones telling the story tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks to all those folks who provided not only direction in the cultivation of this rich collection and collaboration that went into 200 Nights of Freedom. Thanks to all the archivists and the historians and the librarians who've done a great job helping to make sure the history is preserved. And thanks to all the cultural organizations and other institutions who've done their part to help us herald this story very broadly. And, this collaboration brought together hundreds of organizations. We were excited to ultimately see the development of hundreds of programs, several hundred programs, in fact. And so it was a very remarkable community-wide effort.
You ready, Rob? Do you want to start? Let's do it.
Folks, that completes the formal section of tonight's presentation. We are here to talk about history, but we're here to have a conversation with you all about this rich historical drama that played out in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And what we're going to do is this is what we call an all play. So get comfortable with your machines over there. Find your keypads. If you're on a phone, get ready to type. The first thing we want to do is we don't wait for Q&A. We don't want you to wait after 45 minutes of us droning on to get engaged in the conversation. Indeed, this is far more interesting if we take part in some call and response. We want to bounce off of you. We want to hear your thoughts along the way. We want to hear your comments or see your comments along the way. John's going to help us with that process in Command Central. So the first thing we want to do is to get our historical juices flowing, our historical muscles flexed a little bit. Let's talk about the Civil Rights Movement, one of the most hallowed moments in United States history, one of the most important moments in the nation of the globe. In fact, the history of the way this played out across the globe. Sorry about that. So let's get you all involved. Please share thoughts with us.
Key events, places, goals. When did it begin? When did it end? Just put your thoughts out. We just want to
start dropping stuff in the chat. We are all engaging in this conversation together. This is indeed a dynamic process. Key events. March on Washington, absolutely. Absolutely. Some of the heroes, give us some of the names, because what we're going to do is weave some of these thoughts and topics into our conversation along the way. Absolutely, Chelsea. It has not ended, as today, the moment we are in highlights that significantly. Long civil rights movement, beginning of the 20th century, indeed. Absolutely. When would we start the movement? 1954 with Brown. Rosa Parks in the city in 1956, Montgomery. Absolutely. John Lewis, Malcolm X, the sit-ins. Young people engaging in activism that went on to change how we operate in this country. Thank you, young people. And they're out in the streets leading us to a future once again.
As we sit in front of our computers.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you, young people. Thank you so very much. Yes, Robert Williams, Father Groppi, Rosa Parks. Can we get some Ella Bakers and some Fannie Lou Hamers? And let's not forget about Vel Phillips. Absolutely. 1964 was a pivotal year. Freedom Summer. Indeed. Dred Scott, 1850s. The Dred Scott decision, the most nefarious decision from the Supreme Court in the court's history, the Nat Turner Rebellion. We can definitely go back to slave revolts. I was once told by a mentor of mine, the civil rights movement might have started the first time in African resisted slavery. Fred Reed, absolutely.
Fred Reed.
We cannot forget how important artists have been to the movement, to various movements for equality. Artists make us feel. And when it comes to these kinds of stories, when it comes to the histories that lead us down this path, we have to feel. We have to have some humanity about us. Lloyd Barbie, absolutely. When did it end? Anybody want to offer any ideas about the ending of a civil rights movement? The Voting Rights Act of 65 is critical. Changed the electoral process to open up that important bedrock to democracy to so many folks who have been denied access. Angela Davis, as we talk about things like abolition, abolishing our criminal justice system in its current forms. Nina Simone, absolutely.
Rob,
This is great. This is good, folks. Okay, you all are warmed up. Absolutely.
Rob, you're like a slam poet, and they're writing your poem. It never occurred.
They are. That is good. Ezekiel Gillespie. Yes, absolutely.
Ezekiel Gillespie.
Yes, Gillespie. Thank you. We got more comments. This is great, folks. Thank you so very much. This is exactly what we need. This gets us warmed up. This gets us engaged not only with the topics and the ideas, but it gets us engaged with you, helps to break down some of these barriers. We know we've all been Zoomed and what's this platform called? StreamYard. There's all kinds of platforms out there now. We've been dealing with this for several months, so it helps to add. Let's get into my portion of the talk, so to speak. This is informal. Adam might interrupt me. I might interrupt Adam. We have a pretty good back and forth that we do. What I'd like to begin with, though, is I want to help frame this long Black freedom struggle. And I'm going to talk about this in many respects from the perspective of how the scholarship has sort of framed the way we write about and teach about these important developments. We often think about the 1950s and 60s as the modern civil rights movement. But of course, the various efforts to move this nation towards some semblance of racial equality is much longer than the 1950s and 60s. This has been going on for decades and centuries. And so we like to think about this largely through the lens of the long Black freedom struggle. And what I'll do is frame this with 4 key points. And there are others. There are other points that we could use to help frame not only the civil rights movement here in the 1950s and 60s, but then also what happens locally in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The first point we'll talk about is that the modern civil rights movement was a movement to change the law. It's very critical that we think about this in far more sophisticated terms. Why were folks out in the streets? Why were folks protesting? Why were there economic boycotts? To change the law. And it's important that we also say that a lot of what we do is provide these lectures to young people to give them some sense about how to think about the open housing marches. And it's important for us to also, as educators, make sure to provide young people with some sophistication, because indeed they can handle a much more advanced conversation. The second point I'll talk about is that it's been a long movement for Black equality. And we'll talk about when it began, ideas around thinking and shaping the beginnings of this long movement for Black equality. Indeed, we will focus on the local. It's been a movement of local movements. When we think about those places that you all provided in the chat, you mentioned Selma, you mentioned Montgomery, you said 1964, which makes me think about Freedom Summer in Mississippi. It's been a movement of local movements. And we'll talk about the centrality of Milwaukee as a local movement to that broader landscape and that broader narrative. And in that respect, it's been a long movement. It's been a movement that has also been wide. It's stretched across the country. And it's also been very deep, because local issues require local expertise. Local issues require local knowledge and local understanding. And so the movement of local movements has been long, wide, and deep. And maybe most importantly today, we see that youth played and continue to play a central role in social change. Young people have absolutely every right to tell us about the society that they want to see and the society that they want to live in. Let's move to the next slide.
Again, look, the slides are a little sticky for me, so I'm going to do my best.
All right, we can take our time.
Well, we'll start going on. There you go.
All right. Oh, a movement to change the law. We're still in engagement mode. We still want your comments. All righty. We still want you to take part in this process with us. What was that legal system that the civil rights movement, particularly the 1950s and 60s, what was the system called that folks were battling against? A movement to change the law. What was that body of law? It's probably a little bit of a delay, isn't it? Well, indeed, that legal system, that legal edifice was referred, yes, ma'am, thank you, Sarah, Jim Crow, absolutely. The system of Jim Crow, overarchingly, the system of legal segregation was anchored and buttressed in law, and it's really important for us to not lose sight of that. To that extent, we have to make sure to highlight that the broader system of the ways in which racial inequities have formed since the institution of slavery have been codified. Legal mechanisms have anchored our systems of racial hierarchy as such that the notion that whites are at the top of the hierarchy was indeed structured through a set of legal mechanisms. And during the Jim Crow era, if we begin that somewhere around the 1880s, moving forward until 1964 and 5, as those key pieces of civil rights legislation sought to bring an end to that system, Jim Crow manifested as a legal system, a system of legal segregation. It was indeed held together through the process of disfranchisement, denying the overwhelming majorities of African Americans the right to vote. Prior to the 1880s, 1890s, African American men specifically, obviously, were voting in numbers somewhere around 90% in most southern states by the 1880s and 1890s. Certainly, the Black participation in the electoral process in the South was crushed to nearly zero. So the system of disfranchisement held together the mechanisms and the legal framework because African Americans were denied access to actually change those laws. Similarly, the system also was predicated on very clear expressions of economic subjugation that were eerily reminiscent of slavery. Economic subjugation led to African Americans to be forced into the agricultural industry of the South, most notably in the process and through the process of sharecropping. You had obviously African American women forced into roles like domestics. African American men played other roles that reinforced the notion that African Americans were not to in any way compete economically in the system. And then, of course, the fourth major pillar to Jim Crow was the process by which racial violence held together the system in the event folks might attempt to get outside of that bulwark. And of course, spectacle lynching was a central part of that system of racial violence. Whole Black towns were destroyed, such as Tulsa. We had racial violence that attacked Black communities in Wilmington, North Carolina. And so we see racial violence playing a role not only in the destruction of Black bodies, but also the destruction of Black towns and Black communities.
If you're out there and you don't know the name George Marshall Clark, write that down and look it up. That was a lynching that took place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 7 years after the story that we celebrate of Joshua Glover being broken out of jail by abolitionists. That same jail cell, actually, George Marshall Clark was broken out of and lynched down on Water and Buffalo Street.
Absolutely, folks. This is absolutely great. I've got apartheid state in our southern states. Absolutely. De jure segregation codified, 3/5 law in our Constitution. Absolutely. Color of Law by Rothstein, and Richard Rothstein's book is very important because it shows that indeed the system of Jim Crow or the system of racial segregation was not simply a Southern phenomenon. And we know that indeed because we'll get into that. We know that the mechanisms associated with restrictive covenants and other legal codes help to shape and structure our racial geographies that we are in many respects still grappling with today. So yes, indeed, the civil rights movement was a movement to change the law. And oh, strange fruit, I appreciate that. We may have to play that before we get out of here. Okay, now I have to stop looking at the chat. This is great. Good job, folks.
We might need to pick the pace up just a little.
We do, Adam. I always eat up Adam's time. All right, the movement for Black equality has been a long Black freedom struggle. When did it start? We can find any number of beginnings to what we would call the long Black freedom struggle. I like to start in Reconstruction in 1865 with the 13th Amendment: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. Let me say that one more time. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, shall exist. The 14th Amendment: birthright, citizenship, naturalization, due process, equal protection. We know these words. We understand what it means when we use the words due process or equal protection. Maybe because we watch a lot of Law and Order, or maybe there's something about the 14th Amendment that resonates with all of us. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment that protects, that extends the idea that indeed voting cannot be denied on account of race. And so I like to start in Reconstruction because so much of what does not get addressed or what gets undone during Reconstruction then helps to inform what happens in the 1950s and 60s. And again, we could go all the way back to the institution of slavery as well. We could start it there. We could also start this conversation in the 1920s. We could say that there was something happening in the 1920s with Garvey, the New Negro movement that had something to do that helped to inform what would become the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, a generation before. Some folks like to start this conversation somewhere post-World War II. You can start just about anywhere. I like to start in Reconstruction because of how instructive Reconstruction is to this 1950s and 60s moment. Indeed, it was a movement of local movements. We have some of our heroes here on this particular slide. If you know the names of these faces, please drop those in the chat. We should always honor Ella Baker. We should definitely make sure to talk about her significance always when we're having this conversation. But the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a movement of local movements. And by that, we simply mean that this was not a well-crafted national set of strategies. In fact, there were some overarching ideas, there were some overarching themes, but ultimately at the local level, people become very creative about how to challenge those systems of inequality in the places that they live. And so the movement itself, while we understand that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was significant, the NAACP was significant, SNCC was significant, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, certainly these regional and national organizations were critical, but local movements really hold together what become this rich webbing and collection of efforts that make up this broader national landscape. Let's get to the next slide. I've got to rush a little bit, folks, because I got to get Adam into the mix.
Sorry, the slide. Okay, there we go.
And the key point that we want to emphasize, obviously, today is that young people have played a central role in social change. We can't emphasize enough the courage, the bravery, the immediacy of the demands that young people expect out of this nation at any moment was very, very key to how our society evolves and grows and matures. And here are some of the folks that were a part of that rich moment. Members of SNCC, the NAACP youth councils. You see the young man who initiated the sit-ins down in Greensboro, Diane Nash. All right, but also let's think about the way young people continue to push us. Hip hop music, punk culture, punk music. You know, young people have done a great job along the way of continually pushing those boundaries, daring us to move to places that we can't always imagine. And let's not also forget about what happened just a couple of years ago, where young people raised the very important question about gun violence more broadly in our country, and the movement that the young people engineered that led to that remarkable expression out in DC. And as you see, we are flooding this presentation with rich images. When we work with young people, we like to make sure to give them the opportunity to engage with these artifacts as historians themselves, such that they then become exposed to not only the tools of the historian's craft, but that they themselves are welcome to interpret the past on their own terms. All right, Adam, I'm trying to get you there, big guy.
All right, here we go.
Your turn.
Pamela Jo Sargent, in her introduction, mentioned a place named Crazy Jim's Auto Lot. Today, that it was at 16th and National. That's Cesar Chavez and National today. I looked it up for the first time today. Crazy Jim's is still in existence. It's down on South 27th Street, just short of Grange. I bring that up to make this point. Many of the folks you see in this picture, both the protagonists and the antagonists, still are among us today. So people have said this week, you know, this attention to the open housing marches, you know, why is it relevant to the current moment? Some of these folks are still alive. And by that, I mean both the incredible work done by the NAACP Youth Council, but then also those that are standing on cars and telling them they do not belong on the South Side. Just want to share some of these very dramatic images of the open housing marches, just to get you in the mood. In this time, not everyone had a smartphone or a camera. These were all photographers that were out in the streets alongside the marchers documenting this history. The open housing marches were not self-contained. They just didn't end in 1968. They inspired subsequent waves of activism that took place in Milwaukee. In particular, there were Latino activists that looked to the open housing marches as inspiration for what they continued in labor movements as well as other protests. Rob mentioned in his 4 points, changing the law. You see that law up on that sign there, open housing. That was the law that needed to be changed in Milwaukee. You see the youth congregated. Indeed, they did struggle for a long time. That is what constituted the movement in Milwaukee. Before we get to those marches, it's important to understand why they marched for open housing. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Milwaukee had one of the most prosperous Black communities in the entire country. I'm going to say that again because that is not a statement you hear very often. Milwaukee had one of the most prosperous Black communities in the entire country in the industrial heyday of Milwaukee. And Rob, I'm cribbing this again from your Encyclopedia of Milwaukee article. The Black population in Milwaukee went from 7,500 in 1930 to 22,000 in 1950 to 105,000 by 1970. There were Black folks, families coming from states like Florida, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, et cetera, to Milwaukee because there was an incredible amount of opportunity up here. What you're seeing in these images, that's Walnut Street. During this heyday, Milwaukee had the highest Black business per capita of any city in the entire country. What that meant is you can interpret that two ways. There was wealth within the community, but if someone Black in Milwaukee needed something, they needed to get it from within their own community because they were being systematically iced out of any service by white folks. So whether that be a dentist, a lawyer, a notary public, whether you wanted barbecue, wanted to go to a club, oftentimes Black folks in Milwaukee were not welcome in white establishments, so they started their own. Every single building you see here on Walnut Street has been destroyed through urban renewal, in part by the highway, but also cleared to build. This is all on Walnut Street in front of where Elm and Roosevelt is, and there's apartments across the street. This main street, which held such rich history in Milwaukee, is all gone. This map.
Hey, Adam, I gotta, folks, Adam can't see the chat, so I need to let you know, we got folks dropping in words like Bronzeville.
Absolutely. You know, at the time, I looked it up in the business directory. There was a bowling team in Milwaukee named the Bronzeville Bombers. It was not necessarily the commonly used term then in Milwaukee, but it has subsequently become a term to capture the spirit of Milwaukee's Black Golden Age. Can anybody still drop in the chat what this is? What are you looking at right here? Someone actually already hinted at it.
Or not. Images can be found at UWM's March on Milwaukee site. Thanks, Ann. Keep going, Adam. I'm just helping you out with the chat.
No, I appreciate it. Oh, that just by the way, I can't see the chat at all because I'm doing the presentation. So I'm not ignoring comments on purpose. This is a redlining map. Redlining happened around the country. This is what it looked like in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Neighborhoods were ranked A, B, C, or D. The D neighborhoods were then colored in red. Red lines were drawn around them. These are federal documents, and the federal government said, do not invest in these neighborhoods if you're a bank, if you're an insurance company, if you provide any financial product, do not go to these neighborhoods. And if you had any doubt on who lived there, actually, no, I didn't have that one. It is where on the north side you have African Americans living, on the south side you have Mexicans beginning to come into the Milwaukee. This is why people were so frustrated. There were African American folks who could afford to buy homes in Milwaukee. There were plenty of them who could not get loans, who could not build generational wealth, who could not establish themselves in a place they wanted to live and then pass that down to their children while the suburbs were being built. Speaking of which, take a second and just read this. I'm not going to read it out loud. Just read it for yourself. This is a restrictive real estate covenant. As the suburbs were being developed, subdivisions throughout the county of Milwaukee and around the country, in fact, prohibited Black folks and other people of color from living in those places. This was 100% legal. I'm just going to move to this. If you are in a suburb right now,
find your suburb.
You are in a place that had restricted real estate covenants.
It's a new game we're gonna play called Find Your Suburb.
Real estate, yeah. To be fair, not every single subdivision in every suburb had restrictive covenants, but these are just formal documents. Imagine the statements that these are making informally to people.
Shout out to Jill Berry. Jill Berry, how you doing? Yep, absolutely. This was a national effort. Rothstein's The Color of Law. Absolutely, folks. I just want to jump in and let Adam know what folks are saying. Absolutely. Redlining. We're about 30 seconds off. I think we're getting the chats just a little bit behind where you are. So we see you, folks. Thank you very much. And does not include domestic servants. Absolutely, Terry. Go ahead, man.
Reverend Joe Baring for being here. Love you. I'm just going to read the names of the suburbs just in case it wasn't clear. Bayside, Brown Deer, Cudahy, Fox Point, Franklin, Glendale, Greendale, Greenfield, Hales Corner, St. Francis, Shorewood, South Milwaukee, Wauwatosa, West Allis, West Milwaukee, and Whitefish Bay. The two suburbs that are excluded from that list inside of the county of Milwaukee are Oak Creek and River Hills. But don't pat yourself on the back if you're in one of those places either, because I'm sure there were other means by which they communicated.
Oh, yeah, Shorewood have restrictive covenants too. Absolutely.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
If I didn't mention it, and let me just say, Wauwatosa, they're the record holder. So, all right. So what we have is the problem established: open housing, discrimination for housing was totally legal in Milwaukee. A lot of folks who could afford better housing were being crammed into dense, undesirable living conditions, couldn't own their own homes, couldn't hold their landlords accountable. Enter the youth council. So we're going to go to the youth council for a little bit. They were formed. They have a long story, a beautiful history in Milwaukee. And in the 60s, as they were watching the civil rights movement, they went from really being kind of an honor society to saying, we have problems just like they have down south here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We have to do something about it. So the youth council started mounting campaigns, direct action campaigns. They had an advisor, their first advisor, who started pushing them into these campaigns was a man named John Givens. John Givens was a black man who served from Milwaukee, who served in the military abroad in France. He loved his time there so much. The people in France petitioned for him to stay longer. He came back to Milwaukee, was treated with great disrespect, and felt this burning sensation for justice. So from 62 to 65, he was their advisor, started pushing them into direct action, started pushing them into edgier campaigns, some of which the NAACP adults weren't that excited about. But then there was a new guy who was appointed the council, the advisor to the youth council in 1965. The NAACP expected a nerdy-looking white priest wearing Buddy Holly glasses to calm the youth council down. And he was, and I'm going to make this point very explicitly and very specifically in this way. He admired the work of the youth council and said, you know, through collaboration, he can support them to take it further. So tell
Adam, we got a statement here that it was hardly just the suburbs. To be clear, I lived in Bayview, and there was no way a black person would have been allowed to. Absolutely, thank you. So we're going to get to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are still neighborhoods in Milwaukee, maybe one that was just made, that have very, very, very low percentages of African Americans that have moved there. So let's say, let's actually in the chat right now, folks, tell us a little bit about, this is the image analysis part, the who, well, we got to move a little quick, but the who, what, why, when, where of this image.
How old are the young people?
You're doing good on time, you guys. Just a heads up too, so you're good.
Okay.
Don't rush it. All right, this is important.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. All right, we won't. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, John. Folks, what we like to do is give everybody the opportunity to engage the photos. How old is that young man up front there?
Yeah, tell us, and even where is he? What do you think they might?
What is this location? Because I know I saw some of y'all partying there. I was at a concert with some of you folks there.
That's where you saw Erykah Badu, right?
I saw Erykah Badu. Absolutely, Erykah Badu rocked it too. The rave, absolutely. The rave, Wisconsin Ave. What's ironic about this image? It was a whites only club. Who's performing tonight?
So indeed, You guys are untangling it. I think we
Well,
might.
I don't mean who's performing tonight, like tonight. I mean who's performing tonight on this.
Baby is playing. No.
There's an irony. Thank you, Jamie. Yes, Duke Ellington. And so we have a scenario here where these young people are protesting the place that doesn't allow African Americans to enter and take part. But Duke Ellington's playing. Talk about that, Adam.
The drummer, the trombone player, the trumpets, Duke Ellington himself could not go to the box office and buy a ticket to their own show at the Eagles Club. That would be like if Erykah Badu could not buy a ticket to her own show. And just to support that, when they went across the street to try to get a room at the Ambassador, they were probably told no vacancies. Where they would go is Bronzeville. They go to Walnut Street to a rooming house. And they probably play at one of those clubs that you saw on Walnut Street and play a better set.
Oh, yeah, they probably turned it out on Walnut. Yeah, a lot of judges and politicians were certainly members of the Eagles Club. Absolutely. And so the young people are indeed protesting
Absolutely
against the exclusion.
And they're taking it right to the top. I mean, just to imagine the nerve that it must have took. And that guy's got to be 13, 14 years old, 12 maybe.
Yeah, young man, the young folks in the back too. Absolutely. So folks, what we typically like to do is to have people engaging with the images. So please continue, because you all are absolutely right. The images are very rich. You can get them online at the March on Milwaukee site through UWM. Our presentations here and others will be available for you. So you'll be able to get access to this information.
I'm going to do this one real quick so we can get to the next one. This is at the old St. Boniface School, where the Youth Council and Father Groppi tried to have a freedom school and were being prohibited by the Catholic Church. So they protested their own institution. This image is important because look at how young they are. Look at who the St. Boniface, who the Youth Council, who they were. You can see this photo bomber here. You see that?
Right.
You know, that's not new. Photobombing's not new. And even just to get an idea of who's marching, I mean, this guy right here.
How old are these young people? How old are these folks?
This guy is dressed like he's 60, but he can't be a day over 6, right? So youth council, when we say youth council, we mean youth. Absolutely. Some of them
up front. I like this guy too.
You like this guy?
Yeah.
He's not
serious.
So let's move to our next introduction. So we got the Youth Council and their advisor, Father Groppi. This woman was probably about as tall as Pamela Jo Sargent is today, about 5 feet tall. Vel Phillips, you cannot state just how amazing her career was. She was the first woman and the first African-American to serve as an alderperson in the Common Council in Milwaukee. She was the first Black woman to graduate from UW-Madison Law School. She went on to have a successful trailblazing career as a judge. She even was, until Mandela Barnes was elected just a couple years ago, the only African-American elected to statewide office in the history of Wisconsin when she was elected Secretary of State. Vel Phillips was incredible. And she had a life oftentimes where she was the only one in the room that shared her opinion. All right, in the chat, just digest for us a little bit the emotional state of Vel right there in the middle, as well as then her colleagues. This is her at work. Imagine if this was your workplace. What are they thinking? What is she thinking? What's her attitude? What's their attitude?
Somebody called Vel Phillips the GOAT. Put that up for us, John. That's great.
Vel Phillips is
that's awesome.
Yeah, you will never be able to touch it.
Long-standing tradition of awesome African-American women in the city of Milwaukee, folks. Props. She looks lonely. Yeah, she looks lonely. Only woman. Absolutely. It's the only woman and the only African-American. Absolutely. Courage. The boys are not having it. The epitome of diversity and inclusion. Hey, you know, you talk about breaking barriers, knocking down doors and knocking down walls. Absolutely. Lonely, outnumbered, misunderstood. Put that one up for us, John.
Yeah, we see some dismay on her face. We see some determination in her posture.
The comments come so quick that I lose them like
That's
right
all right.
away.
All right. Well,
Yeah,
this
I'm
is-
working. I gotta get them when I can.
Yeah.
So her, in her coworkers, you see everything ranging from indifference to ignoring to anger to apathy. Rob, what do you think those gentlemen in the back are talking about?
They're probably going. They're like, man, hey, let's get together. I heard Duke Ellington's in town tonight. Let's go to the Ray. Oh man, Marguerite, she's so over the bullshit.
Absolutely. Just look at this picture.
Absolutely, I love it. That's great.
An awful place to work. So this is Vel at work. What she did is she brought a bill for open housing to her colleagues 3 different times and was defeated unanimously. She understood many of those men had constituents who were African American. There were Black people living in their districts, and despite the fact that they could be serving their constituents by voting for Vel's bill, they did not. I just love the metaphor of this image that Vel really was on an island, but I think what it also communicates is that there were people who wanted to support her. Vel was on an island in this space, but she wasn't in the community. There were folks who believed in fair housing. And you might see the shape of this story. I'm going to just point this out. It took courage on her part to reach out to the youth council, to call St. Boniface and say, I'd like to collaborate with you. That would be like if the most establishment politicians in the city said, you know what? I need to march arm in arm with the activists that are on the cutting edge, at the vanguard. So she took a risk and said, I am not finding any success with my colleagues in the Common Council. We need to shake stuff up.
She's not backing down. Absolutely, Zakiya. Absolutely.
4th introduction. We need one more player. In August of 1966, a local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, I'll repeat that again. In August of 1966, a local chapter, Milwaukee's Ku Klux Klan, firebombed the building that housed the NAACP. When the youth council said, police, you need to protect us, the police said, if you don't want trouble, stop making trouble. So the youth council took matters into their own hands and created a security detail known as the Commandos. The Commandos were an incredible group of men and are an incredible group of men. We have Reverend Joe Baring here right now, who is a commando. The Commandos started as a security detail, 18 and over. Youth council generally 18 and under. Commandos generally 18 and over, whose charge it was to protect the youth of the youth council. Many of the men had served in the military. Many of them were working factory jobs, had families. Some of them had even been involved in street life and squashed their beef to join the Commandos together and put the skill sets that they built in street life to use for civil rights. So the Commandos, I cannot tell you, we're going to get to this towards the end. Erica Metcalf, the scholar, wrote an article about the Commandos, and I read that article. It really changed my life to know that the Commandos were part of the Milwaukee story, and not that they're in total obscurity, but the fact that they don't get their due. Really, I was itching on page 2 of that article, actually on the first paragraph. The Commandos are an incredible group of men still today.
And folks, when you think about the scholarship and the literature, I want to make sure to share this with you. Obviously, Patrick Jones's work, The Selma of the North, gives us some very important vernacular to think about Milwaukee's civil rights upsurges in this era. But Erica Metcalf, Milwaukee native, she has written some of the most important histories on the role that the Commandos and the Youth Council played in the movement, centering their work as the engineers of the movement. And so it's really, really important that we give Erica just one more shout out, Adam, because she's one of our own. She's homegirl.
Absolutely. And I mean, just while we're on that topic, I do just want to point out the reason that we know so much about this story is Erica's work, but then also the stories that have been shared to us by the youth council members and commandos who are still around to share those stories and tell their own story. So we have established, we got a chat here. Can we get statues, mural of the Commandos, Father James on the 16th Street Bridge?
Amy, we'll get back to you on that. That's an important conversation.
After this and go out on the Facebook. We demand a mural now. Someone Photoshop that before we're done with the talk. So we got fair housing, youth council advocating for fair housing. On the right, on this other image here, you see the assembled group that's going to go get fair housing. And what are they going to do? Actually, they went to the homes of some of the Common Council members over the summer of 1967 to directly picket at their house, started walking around a little bit, liked the feeling of walking, and they decided they announced here on August 26, 1967 in the Milwaukee Courier, a great black newspaper, they're going to march to the South Side. The South Side at the time wasn't just 100% white. It was like infinity % white. There were people who were willing to put their lives on the line to fight for the whiteness of the South Side. So that is it. I will start just by telling you about 125 young people, 120 young people started, I'm pointing north at North Division, where St. Boniface was. They marched the 16th Street Viaduct, were joined by another 120 or so. So they're about a little over 200 young people. They marched south over the 16th Street Viaduct. And actually right now this is a special treat. This is going to be some, we're going to hear Vel Phillips.
Shout out to the folks who were there. I see folks saying they were there.
Ownership of property is tied to many conditions. It is subject to deed restrictions, zoning laws, building and housing codes. I can say only one thing. Since I have every feeling this afternoon that this ordinance will be eventually defeated, you will have to face the issue of fair housing squarely and unequivocally.
We march. We're going to march if they come out or if they stay in the house. We don't care. We're going to march. That's what's wrong. Everybody's been waiting. We're not going to wait.
Well, Father, has your marches to the South Side accomplished anything so far for fair housing?
We're going to get fair housing, not only for the city of Milwaukee, but we're going to get it on a national scene. And it's going to be this consistent type of courageous protest that's going to bring about fair housing legislation. Frederick Douglass talked about this 100 years ago. He said, no one ever got their rights given to them on a platter. You've got to fight for it. You've got to struggle for it. And that's what we're doing. We're protesting.
There are no longer excuses for inaction or delay. Those people who come every day to St. Boniface Church, and they come from all over the country, come there with the idea that nobody is free until everybody is free, and we intend to march, all of us, until we get just some of the basic freedoms that are ours. If ever a matter demanded the urgent attention and forthright action of this Common Council, this is it. Gentlemen, the time is now. Thank you.
August 28th, 1967, those 200 young people start marching across the 16th Street Viaduct. This is what they were met by. That was a Confederate flag. They were met by somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 angry white counter-protesters on the South Side. I've been told not to say angry white Southsiders because they came from all over the place to defend the whiteness of the South Side. There you see them at Kosciuszko Park, Chief Breyer. When they got to the South Side, they encountered this tidal wave of hatred that you're seeing in front of you right now. People yelling racial epithets, throwing rocks and bricks, spitting, throwing light bulbs. The youth council made it to Kosciuszko Park. They started saying a prayer, and a park commissioner, despite the fact they had reserved it for a picnic, came to them and said, you do not reserve this for a prayer or a speech. You got to go. So they got evicted from Kosciuszko Park, went back home that night. It was on the news. It was in the newspaper. And I don't know about you all sitting here in 2020. If I have an uncomfortable conversation with someone, I don't go knock on their door the next day to see how they're doing. But that is just how brave the youth council was. You saw another Confederate flag. When they went back the second day, everyone knew they were coming there were upwards of 13,000 angry white folks. And if you don't believe it, just look at the screen. 13,000 angry white folks saying, get out of this neighborhood now and forever. I want to remind you, the youth council were children. That is white power painted on a car. When they made it back home that night, they went to Kosciuszko Park. This is what they saw greeting them at the Freedom House.
Folks, this is not actually Selma.
This is Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Milwaukee, Wisconsin. You saw counter protesters with well-crafted, well-manicured signs. You saw them with cars painted. That requires preparation. That requires effort. The counter protesters were not randomly arriving. This was a well-sculpted set of counter resistance efforts to young people.
To the point of counter resistance, the police claim they saw a sniper on the roof of the Freedom House, shot a tear gas canister that set it ablaze and burned it down. The first fire that was set was the KKK. The second was the MPD. On the next day, the third day, the mayor outlawed marching. The youth council held a rally instead, and this is what happened when they stepped off the grass and onto the sidewalk. They were arrested by the police solely for virtue of being on the sidewalk. They claimed they were marching, being disorderly, brought them to jail. On the fourth day of marching, the youth council said, you know what, if we're going to be arrested just for rallying, we might as well march anyways. They staged a big march and made it only a few blocks before a ton of people were arrested.
You know, we're getting great stuff in the chat still. We got folks saying that they had family members who were police at the time. Folks who interviewed one of the only white commandos. We got folks telling us that they were throwing bags of urine at the young people. This is good stuff, folks. Thank you for sharing that info.
Yeah, I was just talking to Larry Willis, a commando, a couple days ago, and he was telling me about those bags of urine. So the marches started to grow as the national scene started putting pressure on Milwaukee and saying, hey, you have to support those marches. Milwaukee, I will say this, and I will editorialize this, does not always lead of its own volition, but when people shame us from the outside, we try to get our act together. The marches actually started growing. The man you see in the white hat and the white pants is Dick Gregory, a comedian who was very popular at the time. Community Custard Center. Does anybody know what that is? Drop it in the chat if you recognize that. It's still there today. Different kind of ice cream place.
Indeed, Caroline. These past 2 weeks shows that not much has changed in some respects. In fact, in some cases, the inequities have become even more cemented.
Look at these car caravans, just like we're seeing out in the streets today. So the youth council, they marched. They had a big march with Dick Gregory of about 5,000 people. They marched every day. Remind you, they started on August 28, 1967. Every day in September.
We got Leon's and the Tasty Twist finally. They just a little behind on the time. We appreciate you. What's up, Leona? Yeah, absolutely, folks.
Every day in October, every day in November. This is them on Mitchell Street. They marched all over the city. They marched out to Tosa. They marched downtown. Multiple marches a day. I've heard from some of the fair housing marchers. They still feel it in their body today when they wake up. They would march sometimes 17, 18, 19, 20 miles, multiple marches, and some of them were going to school during the day. This was their extracurricular activity. Yeah. So the marches here in Milwaukee. Let's move this footage. I would wager most of you, if you grew up in this city like I did, you have never seen any of this footage before. The first time I saw this footage, I was stunned. A lot of, I associate these kind of dramatic scenes with the South, as Rob was mentioning before. This is the city that we are in right now. That's Valete Street. That's how we pronounce it here. 6th Street. This is the city. It is important to point out the highway was kind of being built just as this was happening, squeezing the area where African-American folks could live. Really incredible images. These are from WTMJ. This is all newsreel footage, which is why there's no audio. See Vel out there marching. There you go.
So give your kids extra credit. Absolutely. And one of the key statements that we have to say over and over and over, this dramatic development, this all too important upsurge in resistance to attacks on human dignity and basic principles of equality was authored by young people.
Absolutely.
Father Groppi might have been indeed a bit of an advisor, but in terms of his training in the ways of nonviolence, he would have certainly understood the importance of letting the young people lead by 1968 and 69. We'd already seen how important young people had become to movements for equality, whether it was SNCC, SDS, or other young groups led by young people. By the late 60s, we had already begun to see some very radical expressions starting to emerge. And in Milwaukee, what you see is this very interesting merger, this rich merger of what we might consider sort of traditional civil rights activism coming together with the more boisterous tactics, rhetoric, attitudes, engagements associated with Black power. And so Milwaukee provides this rich nexus with the two.
So the youth council, they said, we will march forever. They marched and they marched and they marched. We're going to show you guys some more images here of what those marches looked like. I think this was, actually, I love this on my Facebook. Laniria McGee, Nibby she was like circling people and saying, that's my cousin, or those are my family members. These people are still out there. My friend, Josh Harwell, who I grew up with, some of the Commandos were talking about his uncle, who was in the Commandos. So this is who we're talking about. These are Milwaukeeans. These are our streets. These are heroes. I want to point out just one thing. Keep your eye on the police officer wearing the gas mask. Might be the same guy who's here defending the youth council. That's actually his job, because they are not doing anything illegal. He's defending them from the white rioters. This is him later that evening, perhaps filled with frustration. This is the burning of the Freedom House. This is a great image of the Commandos. This is them at work. This is them strategizing. This is them discussing. A group of powerful Black men. I will just say this, I will editorialize here. We do not hold up groups of powerful Black men in Milwaukee often enough, particularly through history or in the present or ever. So I think the Commandos and who they were is such a powerful example for our city, yet many folks don't know about them.
And for our moment and previous moments, we see the importance of these kinds of powerful expressions of young men. We see equally and as powerful expressions from young Black women. We've seen that today. If you are in any way engaged with what's happening out in our streets today, there are young Black men and women who are at the forefront of these conversations, looking to really paint the world in an image that they think is fair, and we need to follow them, certainly, because they are going to lead us into a better place.
Absolutely. This is at St. Boniface, which again, I was just there yesterday. There is no historical marker there. This is the Commandos. This is one of Rob's favorite images.
I love this image. I love this image because of the empty space. There's so much tension in that space. And we could, unfortunately, probably find images that look just like this today, right? You have these young men on the left. You have armed, militarized folks on the right. In the deep inset there, the image, you see a clash, and you can kind of feel that tension moving forward. I love the way the men are standing. I love the way that they're not only holding their ground, but clearly trained in the principles of nonviolence. This is a powerful image.
Yeah, I mean, another thing is we think of like the idea of optics as a product of the present day. Nonviolent folks totally understood that there were photographs being taken, right? This is sort of like these are the folks who wrote the rules that Instagram's guided by now. This isn't.
Where is this in Milwaukee? For the folks who know the city, take a guess at what intersection this is. Go ahead, Adam. Talk about these guys with these very well-designed, sculpted signs.
I mean, that's important to point out that like those signs are designed by professional designers. Those aren't handmade. Look at their shirts. They're coordinated. You see, even too, in the same way you have kind of the intergenerational thing going on with the youth council, you have the adult in front and the young men following behind him. These guys, I mean, this, and also let's just point out, this is not very long after World War II.
Right.
This is 1967.
Right.
World War II is like, this is the guy in front was a child, was their age during World War II. So
we got 27th and Forest Home.
Yep.
Lisbon, West Dallas. What intersection is that?
That's definitely Forest Home. You can see the Forest Home Beer and Liquor Store up there. the more I look at this, the more I'm not sure exactly. I think it might be 35th and Forest Home, which is exactly where a car caravan was going through yesterday. On its way back from Dallas.
Yeah. Huh.
So I don't know, but here, let's just point this out. This is a response to this. Again, I mean, not to oversimplify, but this is who the invading force was when they went to the South Side, simply advocating for the fact, really, that their lives matter. We have some clergy in the mix. This is Vel. I mean, this is a point I think is really important. When you talk to the youth council members, I ask them this question all the time. How did you guys hold it together? They not only did they love each other, but they sang with each other. They fought with each other. They played. They were truly, when you say community, when you say family, they had each other. And I think in some ways, the heat of the counter protesters forged their bond.
And I think it's important for us to also be very clear about what it takes to sustain a movement. Obviously, the religiosity of the Southern wing of the civil rights movement was critical. But what does it take to keep people inspired? What does it take to keep people believing in a cause, particularly one that is going to be met with such brute violence?
And even the cause too, I mean, something that occurs to me all the time is that these are kids. Their parents are the ones thinking about the housing. So in some ways, they're not even fighting their own fight. Like,
be careful, Adam, now. Wait a minute, brother.
What's that? Yeah, they're not the ones trying to buy a house. I guess right. The point is they're kind of. I mean, they're fighting for their own future. But all the parents' ability to go to banks and take.
Well, they were probably. We've seen some older folks there, but the point is very key, because obviously parents. For whatever reasons, whether they were there or not, were fearful about their young people's safety, and we know we're always fearful of our children, but the young people and the Commandos pushed forward.
So I like this image just because all the black and white images kind of make it feel really distant. But when you look at this, like, I mean, some people probably wear very similar outfits. If it was a few degrees colder, would look kind of similar to this. It just brings it, I think, a little bit more into the contemporary. All right, so the marchers also, we're going to wrap up here pretty soon. The marchers also mounted a boycott of black businesses that were hostile to African Americans for Christmas. They called it Black Christmas. They had their own Santa. This is the day that the Packers played in the famous Ice Bowl game. The marchers in Milwaukee were out in the streets marching. It was cold, and they were probably outside for longer than the Packers and may have burned more calories. This is a telegram that was sent from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Father Groppi in support of the marches, just expressing his the amount of admiration he had for what was going on in Milwaukee, for the exact reason that Rob mentioned before, that it kind of struck that middle ground between kind of himself and Black Power and the kind of Malcolm X school of thought. So
if you go back to that, if you all read that, I mean, it's unbelievable, not unbelievable. It's disturbing that the same themes that we're grappling with today are kind of wrapped up in this missive from Dr. King to Father Groppi.
Yeah. So they marched for 200 consecutive days. The Youth Council, the Commandos, in support of Vel Phillips with their advisor, Father Groppi. And in those 200 days, they actually decided at the end to disband the marches to support Dr. Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign. They actually could not get Vel's bill passed. Despite all their marching, the other aldermen, the Common Council did not budge. Then, literally just within a couple weeks, Martin Luther King was shot and killed. Milwaukee saw one of the largest nonviolent protests in the entire country in response. Milwaukee truly had built an incredible infrastructure of protest.
Wait for it, folks. Hold on a second, folks. Take this picture in. Look at Father Groppi. Look who he's around. Look who he's with. Notice the backdrop. I just want to set you up for this next photo because this is remarkable. Look at that photo.
This is, I'm sure you guys know out there, this is where the Riverside Theater is, where that Subway is, where the Grand Avenue Mall is, where the Planet Fitness is. This is Wisconsin Avenue, right downtown, the heart of downtown. People, as far as you can see, the estimates on this march were about 15,000. It is important to point out that this march eclipsed in size the largest showing of hatred that the Youth Council encountered. There were 13,000 counter protesters on the second day, 15,000 here to show the strength they had built in the city of Milwaukee. It is important to point out, because I posted this photo once on the anniversary of this, the 50-year anniversary, and someone said, I can see Father Groppi. I will implore you to not, Father Groppi was an incredible civil rights leader. I will implore you not to allow his presence to eclipse the 14,999 other people who were there. The majority of the authors of the story of the youth count of the open housing marches were young Black people.
What's going on, Jacqueline? I see you, colleagues over at UWM. This is a great poster. You're absolutely right, Alexis. That would make a great poster.
It would make a great meme too.
Make a great meme. So what we've been doing with the young people, folks, is we take these images, we also encourage them to make memes out of them.
Yeah,
that gets them engaged not only with the history, but allows their creativity to flow quite a bit.
So eventually, the Civil Rights of 1968 was passed, and in Washington, D.C., they discussed what happened in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They discussed Vel Phillips, the Youth Council, and that informed the bill that was ratified across our whole country. Shortly thereafter, Vel Phillips' bill, which was more stringent, was passed in Milwaukee's Common Council. It was signed they won. If you ask the Youth Council members what they did to celebrate, they didn't really celebrate. This picture was taken before. They were on to the next challenge. They were on to the next struggle, the next protest. The Youth Council, I heard even the occasion of the 40th anniversary was one of the first times they'd all gotten together formally to celebrate themselves. I think that just speaks to how incredibly hardworking they were. These images happened shortly thereafter, a couple years on the campus of UW Milwaukee. This is called the Chapman Hall Takeover. Rob and I just did an event about it this week, had great guests sharing some of this history with us. These are some of the Latino and predominantly Mexican community of Milwaukee took over the UWM chancellor's office because he would not hear their demands. This is them looking for Spanish-speaking texts in the Golda Meir library and not finding any. Very clever protest. And eventually they won, leading to the Roberto Hernandez Center, which is still on campus today. Jesus Salas was a big part of that. The reason we mentioned this is that, the open housing marches were spectacular and dramatic. They were certainly not the only protest that took place in Milwaukee, and creating things that we still see around us today, the institutions, the infrastructure of the city that we live in, were in large part, some really important contributions to it were made through protest.
Hey, Adam, do we have the Facebook page for us? Folks, you all are asking. So part of what we have been doing in the online world is to create modules that teachers in particular can very easily use in the classroom. And so what we do is, go ahead, John.
I'm going to pop the March on Milwaukee page up. Is that what you're looking for?
Set up for us, please.
Yeah, I'll pop that in the chat right now.
Okay, great. And what we've been doing is building these so that they are easily transitioned into the classroom or can be used for online learning. And so we've done several of these on the open housing marches, this presentation and some others. And this month, we're actually doing the same sets of initiatives around Latinx history in Milwaukee. And we started with the Chapman Hall Takeover just this Wednesday. So we'll make sure you get that information so you can check it out and direct your students to it and use that stuff if you like.
This was a publication that we made a couple years ago, Neighborhood News Service, and actually Rob at Curdo. And these are illustrations from Gabriela Riveros. She engaged with the history a little bit. I just just remembered that she made this image of a sign, open housing being handed to a young protester for Black Lives Matter. I guess there's so much potential when we put this story in front of young people. Their minds go all over the place. These are those articles we mentioned before, Erica Metcalf. This is the one on the NAACP Youth Council, which Rob mentioned. I cannot insist more that you should read this one as well. I mean, I read this one first, actually. Commanding a Movement is really incredible. Also, this article by Peggy Rosga, who's the current Wisconsin Poet Laureate, details the marches. It's a beautiful article that shares a lot of the history and more than what we just covered. We also want to give shout outs to Voces de la Frontera and other groups that have continued protest in Milwaukee today. Voces has actually done some protests in Milwaukee that have eclipsed that 15,000 march for immigrant rights. So there's still powerful protests taking place in the city today. And we wanted to end, this is a person that I love. This is Mary Arms, a youth council member.
Yes.
We just did this Zoom interview 2 days ago, on Tuesday. And here's her talking about what's happening in the streets of Milwaukee, literally as we speak.
I think they're doing a magnificent job, the way they're being peaceful, supportive to each other, and their whole purpose, what they're trying to do. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful fight. And just know that it's not over with. It's not anything that's going to be quick. It's going to take some time, but at least you're starting off. You're one foot in front of the other. Each step you take, you're benefiting the world. Even if you can't complete it or you can't finish it, at least you started it.
The beautiful struggle.
So if you're an educator out there or you're just interested in educational materials on it, this is our bit.ly that our incredible education committee has created. They've gotten together some of the educational materials. This is a meme that Rob loves because he's a Gen X guy. I also love Wu-Tang as well.
City, cash rules.
I just figured we'd end our presentation on a high point there. So that's the formal part.
Yeah.
That's it for us.
Oh, where'd Rob go? We lost Rob. Let's bring him back
Here
in.
somewhere.
There we go. There we go. I clicked the button. It went weird. Thank you guys. That was awesome, and I love the interaction. I think now we're on about an hour and 15 minutes, which is awesome. So if we want to take a few minutes for questions, that'd be great, and some more discussion, especially as this was stuff that was happening over 50 years ago, and now we have another situation in the country where we see marchers and things like that. And so one of the schools, I'll get it started off. But if you have any questions for Rob and Adam before we sign off tonight, put them in the comments. I'll put that up in the banner on the bottom here too.
Hey, Hanlon, what's going on?
There's
Amber,
a school of thought, and I just, I think there
needs the bit.ly again. Can we put the bit.ly back up, or do you know it right offhand?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
I don't know if that helps actually because it'll disappear. It's bit.ly/MKE March. MKE March. So
I think putting it in the chat is good though too, because then they can find it later.
Okay.
But yeah, so there's a school, there's a school of thought, and I guess what I'm looking for is how do you respond to people when they say, why can't these people just? And that's how they start their sentence.
With the today,
with the marchers, or with what how do you respond to that kind of? How would you respond to that kind of conversation where you're trying to say, I stand with these people, and they're like, yeah, but why can't they just?
Well, first of all, let's be clear about what has been the longstanding history, and I'm assuming you're referring more to this moment, right?
Yeah, this moment, yeah. But I mean, I also have. I'm not from the Milwaukee area originally. I do have family that lived in the southeastern Wisconsin region, and they bring up Father Groppi in the sense that, that was the guy that was causing trouble down there in Milwaukee, well, and why can't they just blank, And so I feel like that's still like a standpoint or viewpoint of some people now, where it's just like, well, why can't they just do the alternative? I don't understand. So how do you combat that kind of thinking?
You can't look at the history of restrictive covenants and residential segregation and redlining. You can't look at the history of employment exclusion. You can't look at the history of denials of full and equitable education. You can't look at the history of voting rights, even post 1965 in the act. There have been so many attacks on voting rights. You can't look at these issues and in any way spend any time with them and come away with a different answer than it's been a longstanding systematic effort to not only deny African Americans some basic fundamental rights, but that is indeed it privileges white Americans. That is not news at this point. If it is, it's because you are choosing to ignore. And that's just where we are right now with this reckoning that we're having to have in our country. This is the fight in a set of resistance movements to police and state violence and murder. But this is also a reckoning with America, in particular with white America. The fundamental question is do you want our nation to be run by white nationalists? That is the fundamental question. And if you're on the side of justice, there's no in between, there's no equivocating.
Well, I think another point that's being brought up right now is people are taking a really hard look at where our resources are going, right? Where are tax dollars going? What are they funding? And I think kind of the long and depressing coda of the open housing marches is the consolidation of white wealth in the suburbs outside of Milwaukee. I think an important point to point, as Milwaukee deindustrialized after the open housing marches, and you saw the region lose about 100,000 manufacturing jobs, about 30,000 of those went out into the suburbs just a mile beyond the end of the bus line. So we sometimes think that, it was jobs going to other countries. A lot, even those blue collar jobs, a lot of those just went out into predominantly white communities. And so, in some ways, like as Rob just mentioned, there's also like subtle ways in which that manifests. Like there's those ideas of white nationalism, but there's also a lot of folks that are putting out right now these critiques of how white supremacy culture exists, not just in these really overt ways of people holding Confederate flags on the 16th Street Viaduct, but how that permeates a lot of the infrastructure and the concrete that we've invested in over the last 50 years. So that is not a very hopeful comment, but
let's get to this question from Alexis, John, because I think it's not the direct response, but it's an important question about how this empowers young people. When young people see their history and see themselves connected to history in a very rich and meaningful way, it is indeed empowering. And we only know this because they told us so. It was the young people, and actually it was the young people in some challenging situations who we were working with who gave us the best insight on how to teach this with them and to how to continually engage young people in this history. They told us that they needed to see themselves in the conversation. They needed to take part in the learning process. And when we began to communicate with them about the ways that they've impacted society, they lit up.
The very first time we went into the juvenile detention center and we shared this story with some young men and some young women. And this sounds like I'm making it up. One of the young men said to us afterwards, if I had known this story, my life might be different right now, and it's probably too late. It sounds like I'm making that up because it's so dramatic, but this is a young man who literally his jail cell opened. Rob and I are standing there. We tell them this story, and he makes that connection himself.
And at the same time, there were obviously young men who we know continue to engage with us as we revisit the place periodically, and also so we know that wasn't the end of the story for that young man.
Is that Aunt Ann Lou? That's your aunt now too, Rob. That's Aunt Ann's asking.
Aunt, what's going on, Auntie?
Do you see a white awakening in Milwaukee, whereas the faces in the protests today are more diverse than in the past? I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, someone was remarking on that to me yesterday that the marches, you don't see massive counter protests. I will say that's because we've sorted ourselves along geographical lines in large part. Like the counter protesters kind of don't have to deal with the geography of Milwaukee because of where they've moved. And I guess I heard Rob and I were in a conversation with Howard Fuller earlier today. There could be a white awakening, but time will tell, because it doesn't matter what people say. If Black Lives Matter, the idea of saying it become less radical and more mainstreamed, the real question is, when you look at the agenda of the Black Lives Matter movement, does that reach the level of policy in organizations and institutions? Does that become embedded in our schools and our practices? So, and my sister's here as well. Hello, Eileen. And my sister-in-law, I saw Kate before. Rob and I have done this dozens of times. And like a lot of times We just go from room to room, stage to stage doing it. And interestingly, the pandemic has introduced this digital idea. So it's cool that we get to talk to, like, you know, people who know us have never seen us do this before.
Yeah, and folks, thank you for dropping in. Selena dropped in teaching for Black Lives. Liana dropped in life after hate. Yeah, that's awesome. And oftentimes when we're working with the teachers in the online format, they're sharing all kinds of resources with each other. Absolutely.
Oh, Rachel McGraw too.
Rachel?
Leanna asked a question before about the white counter protesters and whether we've had dialogue with them. And the answer to that, personally, is I have talked to a few people who were on the other side, of which there were way more. But that is kind of like a big, that stuff is still stigmatized. I mean, this is sort of a thought experiment I use. It's like, you know, those white power signs are in a garage somewhere, right? Like, so they're out there. Maybe Milwaukee County Historical Society, you guys could start collecting those. I mean, frankly, like we've done history harvests, and you do get all the protagonists coming out and want to share those stories. To aim one at you know, a white reckoning one would be really important.
Well, you know, you all are gonna, Jenny Brand, I want to respond to that.
Can I get in real quick, Rob?
Yeah.
So in reference to collecting, so that's one thing that our curator Ben Barbera wanted me to pass along to everybody who's watching tonight too, is we are actively collecting for our collection as far as what's happening in the world now with the protests and COVID-19 and things like that, as well as that historical thing. And while obviously we don't want to glorify certain sides of things, but I think it's important to have, we as an organization think it's important to have as well, the different competing sides and competing ideas when we tell these stories. So if anybody does have some of those artifacts, that we would be very interested in preserving them, because that's what we do. We're a nonprofit meant to preserve and educate about Milwaukee County history. So just go to MilwaukeeHistory.net and all the instructions on donating it right there. Sorry, Rob. Thanks.
No, I was just referring to Jenny. Jenny mentioned that the protests being planned in the suburbs. Yes, you all living in the suburbs, you are going to see more protests. Just know that. And you're going to hear people chanting things like "March with Us." You're going to hear folks blowing horns and all that. There's going to be car protests too. Join the protests if you like, but rest assured and understand that these folks are raising awareness. They are raising attention, and they are asking very simply that we begin to treat one another with some humanity and some dignity.
I want to touch on some comments here, Ronte.
I'm going to give you like a 5-minute warning too, guys. Just a heads up. We're running
almost
to an hour and a half right now.
Are we already at that 5-minute warning?
We still got over 350 people right now, but so I'm happy to keep going. But at a certain point, we got to wrap up. So about 5 minutes.
I want to just address this question Ronte Butler has here about what we're doing to make spaces information more inclusive to Black and Brown people interested. You know, that's a great question. Rob and I have been working kind of with, it's sort of Sisyphusian, rolling the boulder up the mountain and seeing it come back down to the bottom. Rob, you know, I texted Rob late at night last night. Do you want to do this lecture 200 times, or would you rather just MPS taught it? That's, and to me, I know Rob said, let's teach it, do it 200 times. But really, like, we would love for this story to be one that young people saw as their own and was offered to them within school settings. You know, like a lecture like this is great, but like this should just be things that all kids are learning just as a course of being educated within this city. I didn't mention it yet, but this is the high school I went to, Rivers King High School. I went to great public schools, and I tell Rob this all the time. I didn't like history because it was so, well, first of all, it never had anything to do with anything around me, but it was also really Eurocentric when it came to Milwaukee. I mean, so the Eurocentricity of the project of history in this city, I think, has done not irreparable, but massive amounts of damage to who gets interested in history and the practice of it. When it's such a powerful, you know, as soon as I started learning stories about my own city, it's become my whole life. But it's in part because we just keep them away from young people, and it's just messed up. And I see some King grads out there.
Here we go. You know, Liana, you know, we'll come do whatever you ask. So it's absolutely, Liana. And for any other folks, we will certainly do the lectures. And like, these protests are not going anywhere. Like, yeah, I know there's a fundamental question about what's the sort of energy of this. These are not going anywhere. And one of the things that Adam and I recognize is one way that we can be involved is by sharing this history, and then also connecting this history to the longstanding issues that are still with us, emphasizing the key roles that young men and women, young people in general, are playing, and just to do our part to continue to raise these conversations in the way that we do. So so buckle in, folks. It's gonna be a ride.
Rob, can I make this offer? Elena just pointed out in the comments, Carmen Northwest. We've actually been out to Carmen Northwest.
Oh yeah.
We haven't been to nearly enough schools though. I mean, we've literally never done this story at Rufus King. During the last hour of the last school day before the pandemic shut down MPS, we were at Milwaukee High School, the Arts. Just a couple of days before that, we were with students from South Division High School. Probably, I mean, Rob and I, we have never turned down a request. I mean, like literally, if you were out there and you have a classroom, we'll be there if it's 2 people or 2,000.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to kind of leave off for tonight. We'll look at the comments throughout the next day or so and try to address any questions that did not get answered tonight. Rob and Adam, thanks so much for leading this discussion here tonight.
Thanks for having us.
And bringing this perspective of the past to the present, and that kind of thing. We really appreciate it. Because we got more talks coming up. We're as a historical society, the organization's been around since 1935, and we are as I said about collecting. We want to make sure we're collecting diverse stories now, because for a long time that wasn't happening at the Historical Society. And we don't, we are Milwaukee County Historical Society. We want to represent the diversity and the celebration of that diversity within Milwaukee County. So look for more, hopefully, talks similar to this on similar topics in not only the coming weeks and months, but beyond that too. So, we have a commitment to that as well. A lot of people are asking how they can educate themselves past this. So I'm just going to flash this up real quick again. So the Sum of the North book, which does a good job of going in depth again on what we talked about tonight. If you want more about civil rights activism in Milwaukee, we have a book on that too. And then there's a great Wisconsin Public Television DVD about Vel Phillips that you can get. It's all for sale at milwaukeehistory.net/shop, and we'll work out how to get that to you. But again, Robert and Adam, thanks so much.
I just one story. Sorry.
Yeah, go for it, man.
Pointed out, come to North Division. We were just at North Division 2 days ago. We're doing some interviews with Commandos actually, and the groundskeeper was mowing the lawn, and we needed he finished mowing the lawn just as we were starting the interviews, and he started a conversation with the Commandos. He did not know that the land that he was mowing is where St. Boniface used to be, behind North Division. Mm. And the Commandos were telling him about it, and they were having this great conversation. And I know for a fact the students then also don't know that history either. So that just how disrespectful we are of our own treasures. These incredible stories. Fred Reed always calls it hallowed ground anytime we're behind North Division, where St. Boniface used to be before it was torn down. Yeah. Again, we have as the protesters are marching through the streets, it is indeed hallowed ground. Even if their stories weren't taught to them in school, they're living in that legacy.
Man, we'll come give the talks anywhere. Adam,
how about the FBI, Rob? Want to go to the FBI? You've been to the FBI, for real.
All right,
back to you on that one.
All right, we're gonna end our broadcast right now. I think I owe you guys some beers, so sure. But thank you everybody for tuning in and supporting not only just general knowledge of Milwaukee, but the Milwaukee County Historical Society. MilwaukeeHistory.net is where you can find the information on pretty much everything if you want to support more stuff like this. And then the March on Milwaukee Facebook page, March on Milwaukee 50th Facebook page, is where you can see. I know you guys do. Do you guys do talks every Wednesday?
Yes, every Wednesday noon.
So if you like this kind of setup, make sure you like that Facebook page, and you can join in more discussions like that. All right, everybody. We'll see you next week. We're talking about historic beer next week, which sounds ridiculous right now. That's what we're doing next week. So I hope you tune into that too. And have a good weekend, everybody.
Take care, folks.